The storm arrives without warning. It is 2:17 in the morning somewhere in the high desert, and the Meridian Array Observatory is exactly what it has always been at this hour: cold, dark, and utterly alone. The complex sits on a vast plateau ringed by silence, nothing for 40 miles in any direction except scrubland and sky, and the particular quality of emptiness that exists only at altitude, only at night, only when the rest of the world has agreed to be somewhere else. The satellite dishes, 11 of them, each one taller than a 5-story building, stand motionless in the dark like enormous prayers aimed at the wrong kind of heaven. Lightning pulses behind the mountains to the east. The dishes do not move. They are always listening. Inside the main monitoring room, Dr. Lena Vasquez is on her third cup of cold coffee and her second hour of staring at a waveform display that has shown her absolutely nothing of interest. She is 34 years old, has been awake for 19 consecutive hours, and is the only person in this building who has not yet found a quiet corner to sleep in. Around her, the machines do what they always do. Printers chatter. Processors hum. 17 screens display the unbroken hiss of deep space background radiation, the ancient, indifferent noise of the universe at rest, the leftover echo of a creation event so enormous and so distant that even the light from it is now older than everything alive on this planet. Vasquez rubs her eyes. She reaches for the coffee. She sets it back down without drinking it. Something is different. It is subtle enough that she almost misses it. The waveform on channel 7 has developed a faint secondary rhythm, a ghost line sitting just beneath the primary noise floor, barely visible, the kind of anomaly that most operators would dismiss as equipment interference or atmospheric bounce. She almost dismisses it herself. But something in the pattern, something in the spacing between the pulses, makes her lean forward instead of looking away. The pulses are not random. She pulls up the frequency analysis. She overlays a noise filter. She reduces the interference signature from the storm and magnifies the secondary pattern. And then she sits very still for a long moment because what she is looking at should not exist. The pulses are occurring at intervals of 7.3 seconds, then 14.6, then 29.2, then 58.4. Doubling. Each interval exactly double the last. Not approximately double. Not nearly double. Exactly, precisely, mathematically double, to a degree of accuracy that no natural cosmic source, no pulsar, no magnetar, no stellar remnant of any known kind, has ever produced. This is not a pattern the universe creates by accident. This is a pattern something creates on purpose. She calls for Dr. Okafor. James Okafor is awake and at her shoulder in 45 seconds, and within 3 minutes they have woken the other 2 researchers. Within 12 minutes, all 4 of them are standing in front of the waveform display saying nothing, because none of them has language for what they are looking at. The storm hammers against the metal walls. Lightning strobe flashes through the reinforced windows. The waveform pulses on, doubling and doubling, perfectly patient, perfectly structured. And then Dr. Okafor does something that will haunt every person in that room for the rest of their lives. He runs the origin trace. The signal is not coming from a star. It is not coming from a galaxy, or a quasar, or any known astronomical object. It is coming from a bearing of 14 hours 29 minutes right ascension, 48 degrees declination, a patch of apparently empty space at a distance of approximately 76 light-years from Earth. And the trace algorithm, which cross-references all incoming signals against a database of known transmissions, produces a result that makes Okafor's hand stop moving on the keyboard. The signal matches. 93% confidence. Then, as more of the waveform processes, 97. Then 99.8. It matches a transmission humanity sent into deep space 41 years ago. To understand why that should be impossible, you need to understand something about distance. Light, the fastest thing in the universe, the absolute speed limit of physical reality, travels at roughly 186,000 miles per second. In a single year, It covers approximately 5.88 trillion miles. That distance is 1 light-year. The nearest star to our Sun is 4 light-years away. The object cluster toward which the 1983 Meridian broadcast was directed sits at a calculated distance of 76 light-years. A radio signal traveling at the speed of light toward that bearing would take 76 years to get there. Another 76 years to return. Round trip, 152 years, minimum, under ideal conditions with nothing in the way. The signal that appeared on Lena Vasquez's display in the middle of that storm had been traveling for 41 years. 41. Not 152. Not even close to 152. But what they discovered next was even more disturbing than the physics. The signal that went out in 1983 was a specific thing. It was called the Meridian broadcast, and it had been assembled by a team of 22 scientists, linguists, mathematicians, and astronomers over a period of 3 years. It contained mathematical sequences, representations of human biology, recordings of music, samples of spoken language in 12 different tongues, images encoded in binary, and what the original team called a greeting, a careful, optimistic, precisely engineered message from one civilization that hoped it might not be alone. The broadcast ran for approximately 40 minutes of transmission time. Every bit of it was meticulously documented. The team knew exactly what had gone out into the dark. What came back was not exactly that. It took the team at Meridian 11 days to catalog what they were calling the echo, their deliberately neutral term for what they had received, chosen carefully to avoid the implications of words like reply or response. In those 11 days, 3 things became apparent. First, the echo contained all of the original Meridian broadcast, reproduced with perfect fidelity. Second, the echo contained approximately 4 minutes and 17 seconds of additional content that had not been transmitted in 1983. And third, nobody, not Vasquez, not Okafor, not the 6 additional specialists quietly flown in during the second week, could determine what the additional content meant. But they could tell it was structured. They could tell it was intentional. And they could tell, with growing unease that nobody wanted to put directly into words, that portions of it seemed to be in response to specific elements of the original human transmission. And then the signal changed again. On the 14th day, the echo shifted. Not dramatically. Not in a way that was obvious at first glance. But the secondary waveform that had been riding beneath the transmission began to modulate differently. The mathematical intervals that had originally doubled in perfect sequence now introduced a third pattern, nested inside the first 2. A fractal rhythm, self-similar at multiple scales, the kind of structure that appears in coastlines and fern leaves and the branching of blood vessels and nowhere in the astrophysical record of any signal humanity had ever received from space. Dr. Marcus Shields, a signal analyst brought in from the Naval Research Laboratory, looked at the new pattern for 40 minutes before he said anything. What he said was, "This is responsive. Whatever this is, it's responding to us analyzing it." Nobody in the room laughed. Nobody told him he was being dramatic. They had all been thinking the same thing for days. To go back to 1983 is to enter a different world entirely. A world with different fears, different hopes, and a relationship to outer space that feels, from this distance, almost heartbreakingly innocent. The Cold War was at full temperature. The space race had already been run, and its victors were arguing about what came next. SETI, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, was a young discipline caught between scientific legitimacy and public ridicule. And in a converted military communications facility in the high desert, a team assembled by the newly formed Meridian Institute was preparing to do something that had never been done on quite this scale. To transmit a deliberate, sustained, powerfully amplified message toward a region of space that contained a cluster of sun-like stars at a distance considered, in those years, to represent a promising neighborhood. Margaret Chen was 28 years old and the youngest member of the transmission team. She is 81 now, living in a care facility outside Portland, and her memory is still sharp enough to describe the night of the broadcast with startling clarity. We were euphoric, she says, her voice steady even now. We knew rationally that nothing would come back in our lifetimes. We all knew that. But there's something about sending a message, the act of sending it, that fills you with this feeling. Like you've done something permanent. Like you've written your name on the universe. She pauses. Outside her window, rain is falling. I never thought I'd live to see anything come back. I never thought anyone would. She closes her eyes when she says the next part. I never thought I'd wish it hadn't. But this is where the story becomes genuinely difficult to explain. The team of specialists assembled at Meridian in the weeks following the initial detection represented some of the most credentialed minds in astrophysics, cryptography, and signal analysis in the country. They had security clearances and equipment and time and motivation. They had 11 copies of every piece of original documentation from the 1983 broadcast. They had the Echo, digitally preserved in 6 independent storage systems. They had everything they needed to explain what had happened. And none of their explanations worked. The leading hypothesis in the first weeks was what the team called the structure bounce theory. The idea that the original Meridian broadcast had encountered some unknown physical structure in deep space, a dense molecular cloud, a dark matter concentration, a gravitational lens of extraordinary precision, that had reflected it back toward Earth with a travel time inconsistent with simple light-speed propagation. Perhaps the signal had been compressed. Perhaps it had traveled through a gravitational shortcut that physics had not yet fully described. Perhaps there was a phenomenon at work that current science simply lacked the framework to categorize. This explanation accounted for the impossible timing. It did not account for the additional content. The second hypothesis, advanced quietly by Shields and 2 colleagues who were careful not to put it in any official report, was interception. The idea that the original signal had been received by something capable of receiving it, that something had examined and modified the transmission, and that it had then been sent back. Not reflected, not bounced, but deliberately, purposefully returned. With additions. This hypothesis accounted for the additional content. It did not account for the timing, because if the signal had been intercepted by something 76 light-years away, it could not have returned in 41 years under any known physical model. Unless it had not been intercepted at 76 light-years. The third hypothesis emerged slowly, in fragments, assembled by different researchers independently and then compared with considerable alarm. It began with a question someone asked during a late-night session in the third week. What if the signal had not traveled to its destination and returned? What if it had traveled somewhere else entirely, through some fold or distortion in spacetime, and what it had encountered there was not distance but time? The room was quiet for a long moment after that. And then someone pointed out the dates. By the time they realized what they were hearing, it was already too late to unhear it. The dates had been hiding in the additional content for weeks. They were not obviously dates. They were embedded in the numerical sequences of the new material, woven into the mathematical structure of the fractal pattern, invisible until someone thought to look for them through the right analytical lens. But once Dr. Priya Anand, a mathematician on loan from MIT, developed a decoding approach that treated the additional content as a kind of overlay, a second language written on top of a first, they began to resolve with terrible clarity. The dates were in the future. 7 of them, spanning a period from 11 months after the Echo's detection through approximately 60 years beyond the present day. Some were precise to within a day. Others were given in ranges of weeks or months. All 7 were accompanied by what appeared to be numerical descriptors, figures that, once the team had developed enough fluency in the overlay language to interpret them, appeared to represent quantities. Of what, exactly, was unclear. Population numbers, perhaps. Or perhaps something else. The first date on the list was 9 months away. Nobody slept well after that. The psychological deterioration of the research team is documented, though much of the documentation remains classified or contested. What is known is that by the end of the 6th week, 3 members of the team had formally requested reassignment. 2 others had been quietly encouraged to take indefinite leave. Dr. Okafor, who had been among the first to see the echo, began keeping a personal audio diary during this period. Recordings that were later discovered by his wife, Elena, after his hospitalization, and that have never been made public in their entirety. There is a quality to listening to the same 40 minutes of transmission over and over for 6 weeks that I cannot adequately describe, he says in one of the recordings, his voice flat and careful in the way of someone who has been careful for a very long time. You begin to hear things that are not there. Or, and this is what I cannot stop thinking about, you begin to hear things that were always there and that you simply lacked the cognitive framework to process before. I am no longer sure which of those is happening. I am no longer sure there is a meaningful difference. He pauses for a long time. There is a voice in it. Not a voice like a person speaking. A voice like something using the concept of a voice. Using it as a tool. Using it because it understood that we would respond to it. And then the transmission began predicting things it should not know. The first prediction came true on a Thursday in November, 14 weeks after the echo's initial detection. It was not a catastrophe, nothing so dramatic. It was a scientific event, a specific and unexpected astronomical observation made by a team in Chile that had no connection to the Meridian project, published in a journal that the Meridian team was monitoring only because one of Anand's algorithms had flagged the publication date as significant. The observation matched, with a precision that defied coincidence, one of the numerical descriptors attached to the third date in the echo's future sequence. 3 researchers independently confirmed the match before anyone said it aloud. The room was very quiet. Then someone started laughing, and then stopped, and then left the building and did not come back for 2 days. The story of the Meridian Echo, as it came to be called in the small and increasingly fractured community of people who knew about it, is not one story. It is several stories happening simultaneously, and sometimes in contradiction, like multiple radio signals occupying the same frequency and drowning each other out. There is the official story, which says very little. A classified research program. An unresolved signal anomaly. No conclusions reached. No public statements issued. Ongoing investigation. The kind of language designed to communicate that something happened while communicating nothing whatsoever about what it was. There is the story told by the researchers themselves, the ones who are willing to speak at all, and this story is fragmentary and contradictory and shot through with the kind of careful qualification that sounds, to anyone who has spent time around people protecting both their reputations and their sanity, like someone describing something they are still not sure they actually experienced. And then there is the story that exists in the spaces between those 2 stories, in classified documents obtained through decades of FOIA requests, in personal diaries and audio recordings and emails that were never meant to be seen, in the testimony of people who were adjacent to the project and absorbed its radiation without ever being officially part of it. This story is harder to hear, but it is the only one that makes sense of the whole. But what the documents revealed was even more disturbing than anyone had expected. The hidden content of the echo was not random. It was not noise. And it was not, as some of the more desperate early theories had suggested, simply a reflection of the original Meridian broadcast distorted by some exotic physical phenomenon until it appeared to contain meaning it did not actually contain. The hidden content was structured in ways that required intention. It referenced specific elements of the 1983 transmission in ways that demonstrated understanding. Not mimicry, not echo, but comprehension. Something had read humanity's message. Something had written back. And whatever had written back had known things. It had known things about the people who built the original transmission. Things that were not in the transmission itself. Names. Descriptions of events that had occurred after 1983. Details of the research program, the Meridian project, its funding, its personnel, that post-dated the original broadcast by years. as if the source of the echo had access to information about humanity that extended well beyond what had been sent in 1983. As if it had been watching for much longer than 41 years. Colonel Richard Haas, U.S. Air Force, retired, was one of the military liaisons assigned to oversee the security classification of the Meridian project in its second year. He agreed to a brief interview on the condition that certain specifics be omitted. He is 72 now, a large quiet man with the manner of someone who has made peace with most things and not with others. The thing that bothered me, he says, choosing his words with the care of long practice, wasn't the physics. I'm not a physicist. The physics was someone else's problem. The thing that bothered me was the implication of the timeline. If something out there had information about us that post-dated 1983, then we weren't dealing with a signal that had traveled 76 light-years and back. We were dealing with something that had been in contact with, or at least in observation of, our civilization for a very long time. And that changes the nature of the question. It's not, is there intelligent life out there? Anymore. It's, how long has it been watching? He looks out the window for a moment. And then the follow-up question, which nobody wanted to ask. Why hasn't it said anything before now? What changed? Why now? No one could answer that. And the silence around the question was its own kind of answer. Elena Okafor has not given many interviews. She is protective of her husband's memory, of her children, of herself, and the story of what happened to James is not one she tells easily or often. But she tells it now because she believes it should be told, and because she is running out of patience for the version of events that official silence has allowed to calcify into something resembling truth. James was not unstable, she says. Her voice is precise and even. The voice of someone who has rehearsed this particular sentence many times in the privacy of her own mind. He was not prone to paranoia or delusion. He was methodical and skeptical and deeply, almost aggressively rational. Whatever happened to him happened because of what he encountered, not because of something already wrong with him. I need people to understand that. James Okafor was hospitalized for the first time 18 months after the echo's detection. The official reason given was exhaustion and stress, the language of institutional discretion. What Elena describes is something more specific. Her husband had stopped sleeping not because he couldn't but because he had become convinced, with the unshakable certainty that can accompany both genius and breakdown, that the signal was still transmitting information, and that sleep was a form of inattention he could no longer afford. He said it was like being given a book to read, Elena says, and every time you looked away from the page, the words changed. He was terrified of missing something. She looks down at her hands. He said it was like the signal knew when he was watching. The question of what the echo was communicating, if communication is even the right frame, is one that a small and scattered community of researchers has spent the better part of 3 decades arguing about without resolution. The interpretive frameworks applied to the additional content have ranged from the rigorous to the desperate. Information theory, cryptographic analysis, comparative linguistics, chaos mathematics, and in a few cases approaches that blur the boundary between analysis and something that looks uncomfortably like interpretation in the literary sense. The nearest thing to consensus is this. The echo contains, in its additional content, a structure that can be read as a sequence. A before and an after. A then and a now. The sequence appears to describe, in a language that is not language, in images that are not images, in quantities that may or may not correspond to anything in the physical world, a progression. Something that changes over time. Something that has a beginning and, the most disturbing readings suggest, an ending. Whether that ending refers to a civilization, a species, a planet, or something vaster and more abstract is a question that depends on which interpretive framework you apply, and nobody agrees on the framework. What several independent researchers have noted, carefully and in isolation from each other, is that the sequence in the additional content appears to begin at a point corresponding roughly to the present era of human history, and that it is not a long sequence. And that is when the transmission began to feel less like a message and more like a record. There is a theory, never published, never formally advanced, existing only in private conversations and the margin notes of classified documents, that inverts the entire framework of the Meridian Echo investigation. What if the signal did not return early? What if it returned exactly on time? What if the error is not in the physics but in the assumption that the broadcast was received at its intended destination, 76 light-years away, and reflected or returned from that point? What if the signal traveled not outward, to a distant cluster of stars, but forward, through time, encountered itself coming from the other direction, and was returned not from space but from a future in which the same transmission was sent again? The implication of this theory is one that most people who encounter it prefer not to follow to its conclusion. If the echo came not from a distant star but from a future version of humanity's own transmitted signal, if it is a loop, self-creating, feeding backward through time to arrive at the moment that created it, then the additional content is not a reply from an alien intelligence. It is a message from a future that has already, in some sense, happened. A future that found a way to reach backward and insert information into the returning signal. A future that knew exactly what the present would do with what it found. A future that had been waiting, patiently, for the present to catch up with what the future had already known. Dr. Anand, who has since left academia and declined to be identified by her current name or location, wrote in a private document shared with only 3 colleagues, a document that was later leaked and has circulated in redacted form for more than a decade. The most frightening possibility is not that we are alone. The most frightening possibility is that we are in communication with our future selves, and that our future selves chose to send back not comfort but warning. And that the warning, which we have spent years trying to decode, was never primarily in the content of the signal. It was in the fact of the signal itself. Its impossibility. Its early arrival. The universe cracking open just enough to let something through. The warning was, something is coming. Something that makes this kind of intervention necessary. She added, below that, and I think we already know what it is. I think we've known for years. I think that's why we're so afraid to finish decoding it. But the signal had one more thing to say. And nobody was ready for it. In the 43rd month after the echo's detection, Lena Vasquez, who had by then resigned from the Meridian Institute, moved to a small town in Vermont, and was teaching introductory astronomy at a community college, received a package in the mail. No return address. Inside was a USB drive and a handwritten note that contained 4 words, "They sent it twice." The drive contained 6 gigabytes of audio files. She listened to the first file with the door locked and the curtains drawn, and then she sat in the dark for 3 hours before she listened to the second. The audio files were recordings of the echo, not the cleaned, filtered, professionally processed versions that the Meridian team had worked with, but raw captures from a secondary monitoring station, an unofficial collection maintained by a network of amateur radio enthusiasts who had somehow locked onto the frequency during the original detection window. These recordings contained interference artifacts that the official data had filtered out. They contained spectral components that had been classified as noise and discarded. They contained voices. Not alien voices. Not the concept of a voice that Okafor had described in his diary. Human voices. Recognizable, language-using, emotionally inflected human voices, overlapping and fragmented and smeared by whatever processes the signal had passed through, but human. Speaking in English. Speaking in Mandarin. Speaking in Arabic and Russian, and at least 2 languages that Vasquez could not identify. She could not make out most of what they were saying. But in the 3rd file, in a window of approximately 11 seconds where the interference thinned and the signal clarified, she heard something she could understand. She heard someone say, "They're receiving it now. This is 2024. This is actually happening. Does anyone, can anyone, are we?" And then the interference closed back over it and there was only static. She listened to that 11-second window 400 times over the next 2 weeks. She had 3 independent linguists listen to it without context, and all 3 confirmed they heard a human voice speaking contemporary English. She contacted 2 former colleagues who had remained connected to the ongoing analysis. She asked them if they had ever heard anything resembling voice content in the echo. Both of them went silent for a long time before answering. Both of them said yes. Both of them said they had been told not to discuss it. By the time the full picture became clear, the signal had already stopped. The echo went silent on a Tuesday morning in spring, 4 years and 7 months after its initial detection. No degradation. No fade. No transition period in which the signal weakened before disappearing. It was present during the 6 a.m. monitoring cycle. It was absent during the 6 a.m. cycle the following morning. In between those 2 checks, 23 hours had passed and nobody had been at the receiver, because everyone was at a scheduled team meeting in a different building. The silence, when it was discovered, produced in the remaining team members a response that none of them quite expected. Not relief, but grief. A sudden, sourceless grief, as if something that had been present, something whose presence had been terrifying, yes, but also real, also unmistakable, also a kind of companionship in the cosmic dark, had simply withdrawn, had looked away, had decided, for reasons that were not communicated and would not be explained, that the conversation was over. The investigation continued for 3 more years in diminishing form. Reports were filed. Analyses were completed. Conclusions were reached that satisfied nobody and were classified at levels that ensured they would not be publicly available for decades. The remaining researchers dispersed. Some retired. Some moved to other fields. Some simply disappeared from the professional record, not dramatically, not in ways that suggested anything sinister, but quietly, gradually, the way that people sometimes disappear when they have encountered something that they cannot carry and cannot put down and cannot talk about. Margaret Chen, who was old enough when all of this began to have perspective on it, and who has spent the years since the echo's silence in a state she describes as acceptance, thinks the obsession with decoding and explaining the signal was always beside the point. We wanted it to be a puzzle, she says. We wanted it to be a problem we could solve. That's what we do. That's what humans do. We take the incomprehensible and we put it in a box and we label it and we move on. But some things don't go in boxes. Some things are just what they are. And what the signal was, I think, was a reminder. A reminder of what? She is asked. She considers this for a moment. Outside her window, the light is failing. Somewhere in the distance, a crow calls once and then is silent. A reminder, she says finally, that the universe was here before us. And that whatever is in it, whatever has been in it, watching or not watching, listening or not listening, it has been here longer than we have. And it will be here after. And the message we sent in 1983, that beautiful, hopeful, naive little message, it was like striking a match in an enormous dark room. You get one moment of light. You see, for just a second, how big the room actually is. And then the match goes out. She pauses. And you realize you're not alone in it. The satellite dishes at the Meridian Array still stand. The complex has been officially repurposed for atmospheric research, a change of mission that required no new equipment and very little explanation. The dishes still point at the sky. The receivers still listen. The computers still process the unending, indifferent hiss of deep space background radiation, the ancient noise of a universe that has never once been quiet. Sometimes, on certain frequencies, on certain nights, when the atmospheric conditions are exactly right and the interference is minimal, and the filters are set to their most sensitive configuration, the monitoring systems log anomalies. Brief. Faint. Almost certainly explainable by known phenomena. Almost certainly. The people who still work there do not talk about the anomalies. There is a culture of silence around them. Not the silence of conspiracy, exactly, but the silence of people who have been close enough to something enormous to understand that describing it only reduces it. That the appropriate response to some forms of knowledge is not speech but a kind of careful, attentive quiet. They listen. They log. They file their reports. And somewhere out in the dark, at a distance that cannot be meaningfully imagined, across a span of time that human language was not built to contain, something that may or may not be listening receives the ordinary noise of a civilization going about its days. The electromagnetic signature of billions of lives. The radio babble of news and music and military communications and cellular networks and satellite uplinks. The unintentional broadcast of a species that has been transmitting without intending to for over a century, filling an expanding sphere of space with evidence of its own existence. The sphere is roughly 100 light-years in radius now, growing at the speed of light, reaching, year by year, into regions of space that are very far from empty. The last anomaly in the Meridian archive, the final entry before the Echo's disappearance, logged at 5:47 a.m. on its last recorded day, is a short burst transmission, 6 seconds long, embedded in the signal at a frequency that the monitoring equipment should not have been able to capture but somehow did. The burst has never been satisfactorily explained. It has been analyzed over 400 times by 26 independent researchers across 30 years. What it contains, if it contains anything, remains disputed. But there is one reading, advanced by a signal analyst who has since retired and who will not attach their name to it publicly, that has never been refuted. According to this reading, the 6-second burst is not a transmission at all. It is a recording, a capture, a fragment of something that was not sent from the observatory but received by it, a sample of what the source of the echo had been recording during the 44 months of its transmission. According to this reading, the 6-second burst contains audio. The audio, when processed, resolves as ambient sound. The ambient sound, when identified, is the interior of the Meridian main monitoring room. The date and timestamp embedded in the audio corresponds to a moment 14 months before the echo's initial detection. Before anyone at Meridian knew there was anything to listen for. Perhaps the most disturbing thing about the signal was never the message it carried, or the physics it violated, or the future it appeared to know, or the voices it contained, or the warnings it may or may not have embedded in its mathematical structure. Perhaps the most disturbing thing was the implication carried by that last 6-second burst, the implication that whatever sent the echo had not been responding to the Meridian broadcast at all. That the Meridian broadcast was, from some perspectives, irrelevant. That the decision to reply had been made long before 1983. That the reply had been in preparation for years before humanity even understood it had a question to ask. That whatever is out there had already been listening when the first human hand reached for the transmitter. That it had been listening for much, much longer than that. And that it already knew, with the certainty of something that has observed this exact sequence of events before, exactly how the story would end.